Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Cardboard Herald, my chance to talk with creative gamers and game creators. And joining me today is a designer in his own right, as well as a co-designer on many hit games, including Resist, War Chest, and the incredible Undaunted series. Welcome to the show, David Thompson.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
That's a lead up, man. You got a lot of weight on your shoulders at this point.
I don't have to carry it by myself, though. As you said, I'm co-designing almost everything.
So you must be feeling good right about now. Like, as we're talking, Undaunted Stalingrad is number 3 on the BGG hotness.
Yeah, yes, I do feel good. Also, though, I'm sure this is a very common thing. It's just the time of nerves. Now it's like nobody's going to buy it, or when people buy it.
Oh, my friend. People are going to buy that game. Yeah. So, I am coming at Undaunted from maybe a perspective that is not uncommon to the Undaunted series and the fans of it, but uncommon for typical war games, in that I've covered war games on this channel. I've covered historical games on this channel, and oftentimes they're these big, daunting, expansive, and somewhat impenetrable things. And unless you're immersed in that culture as like a dedicated fan, it can be really hard to kind of find a foothold. Whereas Undaunted is this series that feels robust and accurate and authentic, but at the same time is made for, stupid little midweight Euro gamers like me that are terrified of some of the deeper stuff. I mean, I like that stuff, but it is a unique and niche culture. And I think that's one of the major accomplishments of your career as a designer, is that you've made this vast and also somewhat opaque niche of games much more approachable and welcoming to people like me.
Yeah, I say this quite often when people talk about sort of the accessibility, if you will, of Undaunted or the Undaunted series. The best compliment I get, and I'm not exaggerating, is when a war gamer, like what you would call like a traditional war game or whatever, thanks me for working on Undaunted with the other folks that I've worked on it with, and giving them a game they can play with their non-wargaming gaming partners, with their spouse, with their kids, right? I mean, I see all the time people send me pictures of them playing with their 11-year-old, right? And it's like, I get to share my hobby with my kid for the first time. And it's like, well, it literally doesn't get any better than that. So, yeah, it's a good feeling. It's cool.
Yeah, I imagine that it's going to sell like gangbusters. You got no worries. People are already lining up thinking about the next Undaunted game, which you've already announced. Like, it's in the works, so you just have like a machine running. But this isn't the entirety of your career. We'll get to Undaunted, and I have some specific questions as a relative newbie to the Undaunted franchise. But let's kind of back it up a little bit and talk about your humble beginnings as a game designer. In my research, it's my understanding that you were starting to get into games in the States, but then you did some sort of maybe work transition, or maybe it was for a school scholarship or whatever. You went overseas and you started designing there. Tell me a little bit about your origin story.
Yeah, so that's right. So I really didn't. I grew up playing role playing games, not board games, really. I mean, I played a few things here and there, but mostly RPGs. And like you said, about the time I started playing board games in general and started dabbling with design was about the time I moved from the US to the UK. And I moved there for my day job. So I moved.
If you don't mind me asking, what field do you work in?
I work for the Department of Defense as an intelligence.
Okay, we're both government employees. Yours sounds a lot more intense than mine, but yeah, there we go.
Almost certainly not. It always sounds way cooler. I'm sure we both sit behind computers all day. So
yeah, very true.
So yeah, I moved to the UK, to the Cambridge area in 2014, and that's when I met a design and playtest group there in Cambridge, and really that's what opened the door to me, for design. Right, because there were established prolific designers like Brett Gilbert and Matthew Dunstan there who built that group up, and they were super welcoming and served as mentors and guides to all of us. And so Trevor, my main design partner, we were both part of that same group. So we have a Canadian American who living in England, designing games together. So, but yeah, that's really how it sort of springboarded, right? I went from a guy who, over a span of like 6 months, didn't have a clue how to pitch a game, to going to Spiel and being able to pitch games and start working on designs and stuff.
Was there any sort of rival organization in Oxford that the Cambridge people were like, oh, we got to design better games than those stuffy necks?
I don't know. Not that I've ever heard of. Maybe
okay, well, I just read Babel, so it's fresh on my mind. Okay. So
I was going to say there's a Thirsty Meeple, which is an amazing board game store there in Oxford. That's what they're known. So they've got the store, we've got the design.
There you go. Of course. There's always a relationship. Find some sort of common ground there. Now, you started this in 2014. 2016, you come out with a co-design with Queen Games, Armageddon. Like, what was that like to start pitching games, and what was a rapid amount of time and have one actually picked up by an established company? I mean, this company has come out with all sorts of games that have been, like absolute, what do they call it? Evergreen titles in the industry. I mean, I'm looking at Kingdom Builder on my shelf across the room right now.
Yeah, so it's an interesting. I worked on Armageddon with another guy from Cambridge, Chris Marlowe. He and I have done a couple of games, Armageddon and a game called Europe Divide. And there's a lot of interesting sort of negative lessons learned, or stories about Armageddon, and I'll get to that in a second. But so really, what happened is Chris, we met up in Cambridge as part of this large group, and he had some ideas for a game, and so we had been playtesting each other's stuff and all that, and so he invited me to work on it with him. So all giving credit where it's due, the sort of origin of Armageddon was Chris's idea, and I came along and helped him work on that. But this is the sort of almost negative lesson learned I wanted to tell folks who are listening, like, oh, I'll design a game and I'll get it published in a couple of years. We pitched Armageddon to Queen at Spiel 2015, and it was published at Spiel 2016, which is that's unheard of. And the other thing that's super crazy is they signed it at the pitch session, which is like super unheard of. Yeah. Right. So like, don't expect any of that, because it's never happened again to me ever. So, it was very strange for your first, and of course, it wasn't the first game I was working on, right? I had games that I've been working on for years that were published afterwards. And that's just the vagaries of that timeline. But yeah, it was a cool experience. And Chris is another awesome guy, great to work with. He's just a fountain of knowledge, and especially when it comes to the Eurogame world. Because it was a really good treat to meet him and get to work with him on Armageddon.
When you look back at your early career as a designer, do you think of mistakes that you made either in designing the games, such as Armageddon, like things that you were like, oh man, this would have been a better game had I done X, Y, or Z, or in how you presented those games, like those pitch meetings? Obviously it went well, but if you gave that same pitch in 2022 to another publisher or even Queen Games, do you think that same pitch would work? Surely you've evolved as a designer and a showcase or a salesman for your games.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, you always, on the game design part itself, for sure, you always look back and you say, I'd love to change this, fix this, or whatever. And it's hard to know, let's say something like Undaunted. If I was to design Undaunted Normandy now, I would have changed things. But
well, you have changed things subsequently. I have changed, most notably the control, right? Like control right. of an area.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's hard to know, because Trevor and I joke about the sort of spiky bits of Undaunted, meaning the things that are least elegant about it are probably the things that we would shave off now. But it's hard to know whether some of those little spiky bits, right, those chromey rules or whatever, are not some of the sort of intangibles that some people like, even if they don't know they like them. And right. So you have to be careful about saying, oh, I would definitely change these things. There's a lot of lessons I've learned. Now, on the conveyance of the pitch, now that's even more complicated, because I'll tell you, I mean, I pitched like Undaunted is objectively a commercially successful game.
Mm-hmm.
So we can just say that independent of anything else. I mean, there were publishers I pitched it to that didn't sign it. The pitch was the same. There was a publisher that actually had signed it and just didn't publish it.
Oh, well,
So I mean,
joke's on them.
yeah. So I don't. It would be very difficult to look back and say, "Oh, I wish I had pitched it" or whatever, because you just don't know what a publisher's looking for. All of those sorts of uncertain. So I try not to have any of those types of regrets. Now, I will say this: almost no game designer does it full time. If it was my full time job, there would be pressure to actually be successful, like commercially successful, and then it would be much more stressful. Not a hobby. Life would be very different.
Well, when you were getting to War Chest or Undaunted, for example, well, no, let's back up, because if we're talking about you designing with Trevor, let's actually talk about you starting to design with Trevor. So you're in the same group at Cambridge, and did you initially get along with Trevor? Was there some sort of synergy in how you were approaching games? Like, what was it that kind of set up this dynamic duo from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that like every relationship, design partnerships, just like any other friendship, relationship, whatever. You get to learn and know each other, right? And so it's funny because Trevor says quite often, because Undaunted was the core system of Undaunted was mostly done when we started working. I had a game that was probably 75%. Now, none of the scenarios and stuff that like the core rules. I say, and I genuinely mean this, like I brought him a game and we worked together, made it a good game, right? And that's true. But he always jokes and said, he would have if he was as comfortable with me now as he was when we first met, he would have pushed back on some of the things that were there. And so now we meet. He still lives in the UK, I'm in the US, but we meet at least 3 times a week for about 3 or 4 hours. So we spend about 12 hours together a week. So there is no secrets. There's no pulling punches or anything now, right? So, but it took us 6 years to get there. So that early, time, we definitely got along at the initial playtest meetings, but it was probably about, I don't know, probably about 6 months of like meeting and just kind of playtesting each other's stuff and getting to know each other before we really started working closely together and becoming more comfortable.
And which came first, Undaunted or War Chest as a design?
So Undaunted came first. And so the way this worked is Undaunted had been sort of conceptualized right as I was moving to the UK, like literally August 2014, something like that. And we worked on it together for a while. And then it was in this weird limbo state of, like I said, signed with another publisher. And so we were just kind of waiting around on it. And so Trevor had the idea of what if we took Undaunted and we just distilled it down to its absolute minimalistic core and got rid of like random combat, this out and this dice rolling combat. That's what turned into War Chest.
I had no conception of the two as like a, I guess, coming from the same lineage. Like, of course, I, recognize that they're from the same designers, but to think of them as like from the same genesis, I guess, like that they're the same system distilled into one to another. A lot of that is presentation, of course. AEG has a very different look to the game than what you see when you have Undaunted on the table. But now that you mention it, yeah, I can kind of see that being distilled down. So when you were creating this game, like this is in the wake of the deck building boom, and in some ways the deck building decline. Dominion came out, and then there was 1,000,000,001 deck building knockoffs. Some were great, some were terrible, some and most were somewhere in between. But then there was this rise of deck building as an engine, as a functional mechanism for another type of game. And this is one of those games that made a huge impression by using it as like, we're a war game that's driven by deck building. Did you have any inclination early on of just like how popular and seminal this might end up being?
No, for sure I didn't. I've said before, Undaunted could be what it is now, which is a game that is a crossover game. It's
Hmm.
a it can appeal to gamers that are sort of new gamers and Euro gamers and war gamers, etc. That's what it's become. It could have absolutely been a game for nobody, right? It could have fallen in between the cracks the other way, and it's like, oh, this isn't a war game, I'm not interested, or this is not a Euro game, it's dice rolling for combat, I'm not doing this. So it kind of in a lot of ways, and I think this because I think it could have easily fallen into that trap. And I think what made it not is the way Osprey presented the game. Right? They have what I think is gorgeous art. There's a personal touch to it.
Hmm.
The way it was produced as a product, I think, is what made the difference. But yeah, I think absolutely there was a chance that it could have been a game for nobody, and I certainly didn't think it would be as successful as it is.
Can you? I don't want to spend all of my time just talking about the origins of Undaunted and now War Chess as well, but like, can you think of specific design hurdles that either of you were going through in designing or developing this game that had breakthroughs? Like those aha moments where the magic of the game started to come together.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's difficult for me because I have a horrible memory. Um,
Well, we're
there's
just
some
going to
there's some
rely on apocryphal information then.
yeah, I can remember some of the areas that we struggled with, like for example, for people who don't know, apologies, but I'll talk about some specifics in the game. So there's a card, the machine gunner, who has a suppression effect,
Hmm.
and all it really does is it's a tempo control. It's like a high probability tempo control. Um, the way the game resolves it now is extremely elegant. You just make a roll and you flip the token over, and the next time you play a card, you flip it back. Cool. At the beginning, when I brought the game to Trevor, we started working on it together. There was this whole convoluted extra layer of stuff that had to happen with the machine gunners, right? And thankfully, he said, "This is ludicrous. We're taking this all out, and we're going to find a more elegant solution." Um, I think that the thing that I think this is true. I think the thing that was always kind of there from the start, and so this wasn't a challenge, but it was a extremely fortuitous decision that just happened this way, was the initiative system. Like, people always comment on how they love the initiative system.
Right, right,
Um,
totally.
I think it was there. I think that we realized sort of subconsciously during the design process how important it was, and we really took advantage of it. Right, we played into it. Um, but yeah, I think that I'm not sure if there was necessarily challenges, but absolutely. Um, I'll just go back to what I said earlier. There was a lot of spiky bits that if it had just been my game by myself, it wouldn't have been nearly as elegant as it is, for
Well,
sure.
I actually wonder about that a bit because there is something about modern tabletop gaming and the environment that we're publishing games in that fetishizes elegance, right? Like everything has to be honed down into like this perfect level of elegance where everything's smooth, everything's approachable, and you do kind of shave off some of those edges that give a game character. And I think Undaunted is a good example of something that balances that. And part of what brings its character is that it is so contradictory to the expectation for the genre that it squarely represents. So I don't think that there's too much worry about it kind of losing its identity. No one has really done what it's done before it, except for obvious comparisons to something like Memoir 44, which is a completely different game, but at least somewhat achieved the same kind of balance that Undaunted is now heralding. But I wonder if the environment that we have now in games is sustainable, because when you fetishize that elegance, it does homogenize games a little bit. I mean, that's hyperbole to a degree, but those jagged bits, as you're describing it, those are some of the best bits of the most iconic games that have ever come out. Can you imagine Agricola or Ticket to Ride or like any number of games if they had been totally and pristinely honed into what a modern game design would expect out of them?
Yeah, absolutely. No, totally agree with you.
So You have designed a lot of games in partnership, and not just with Trevor. Like, you have many co-designs with many different designers at this point, but you also have sustained this career of designing games independently. Do you have any thoughts as to like what types of games you like to design with other designers? Is there a process that you go through where you start with a design and then you figure out, well, this is someone else's wheelhouse? Like, what makes you split in one direction or another?
I used to say a few years ago, I would have said that when I'm working on like more traditional or more hardcore war game or historical war game, whatever you would want to call it, oftentimes those for me are like solo specific, right,
Mm-hmm.
designs. Um, I would say that I would design those by myself
Mm-hmm.
as a solitaire designer, and then the other things that were meant for like a broader demographic, I would co-design. That's changed in more recent years because if you look at some of the more recent solitaire war games that I've designed, I would call those not co-designer, I would call those co-creators because what I've gotten really interested in doing is partnering with like a historical specialist on the game, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. So Nicola Sagini worked on a game called Stuff and Sea. Michael Kochman, Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, etc. I led the game design parts of those, but those guys led the historical research, and they are also gamers. And so um, we sort of each had our own specialty. And so they're listed as designers because there's not a better way to necessarily or more accurate way to credit them on Board Game Geek. But what I've basically come to learn is for myself, I just really appreciate all the positives that come with the co-creative process. And there's a lot of obvious stuff. They bring a lot of specialties to that I don't have, or research or knowledge or whatever that. Co-designers bring a bunch of they're making up for shortcomings that I have or whatever. But there's a lot of intangibles too, and I'll just be totally honest about this. Like if I'm co-designing with somebody, it helps hold me accountable,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yep.
So I know that we have a meeting on Thursday. I better be bringing what I'm supposed to be bringing to the meeting on Thursday, right? And so I know myself, I know my shortcomings, I know my weaknesses, and so if I am collaborating with somebody, it's going to help me out in the long run.
Speaking of solo design, you have also designed a lot of solo capable games. A lot of those are the crunchier war games that you were talking about that you've done independent design on. You've done co-design on some solo capable games. War Chest and Undaunted are not solo capable, at least out the gate, and then came through expansions later on. But I noticed that Stalingrad does not have solo in the box. So, like, is this an Osprey thing? Is this you guys kind of making a definitive decision about solo ability of Undaunted? I know that it was designed by other designers, right? David Turchi.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Yeah, David Digby and David Turksley worked on the solo for Undaunted. And so one thing that I'll say is for me, if the game is going to be a solitaire game, I'll design it that way from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's going to be a multiplayer game, I'll design it that way. And I don't really make solitaire systems for my multiplayer games. It's just a very different approach, and it's not something I'm necessarily I think is a strength of mine. And so that's just not something I've done. I haven't made a solo system for a multiplayer game. So on Undaunted, we did not know. So Osprey runs. You mentioned this in passing earlier. I kind of chuckled inwardly when you said a fine oil machine as far as the Undaunted engine, right? Like what's going on in the
Right,
future.
right.
And that's because Osprey runs a fine oil machine. So we actually had designed Undaunted Normandy had not yet been released, and North Africa had already been designed and completed. We had already conceptualized what might be coming in reinforcements before Normandy was released. So we did not have the luxury of actually seeing the game released to the public and knowing what people wanted. And so we did not know the appetite was going to be there because this is 2016, 17, right? Going into 18. We didn't know there was going to be such a huge appetite for the solo part of Undaunted. And so when we saw that, it was like, okay, we get it. Everybody wants solo. So David Turkey, David Digby worked on it and created it. And the solo for it is, I can say this because I didn't make it, so it's not about me. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. It allows you to. This is ludicrous. It allows you to play like every scenario in Normandy and North Africa and in reinforcements from both sides. So it's like 60 some scenarios. It's just insanity. But they had the luxury of like being able to go back and look at those scenarios. And those scenarios, when you're playing Undaunted, the scenario defines everything. It defines what you're going to start with, what's available to you, what the scenario is going to be like. Stalingrad is not like that, right? So Stalingrad is organic. The only scenario that's scripted about what people are going to have is the first scenario. From that point on, who you have available to you, what the world, like literally the topography is changing, and the game state knows who's won or lost and the implications of that, but the game state has no clue who's actually in the fight. And so what that means is the way that they designed the solo system for the other games could not be duplicated for some. So they would have had to change it, and it would have to be a much more generalized solitaire system. So I think it would just been, I mean, you'd have to design a solitaire system for 35 scenarios with every possible permutation.
So what you're saying is we have to wait for Stalingrad reinforcements, right?
I think that if there, and somebody will make, there will be, if nothing else, there will be a fan community.
That's what I always say in reviews. Yeah. Like if I see a game where I'm like, this really seems like it should be a solo capable game, but there's no solo in it, but you can count on the BGG forums to come up with a solo version.
Yeah,
even
and
the
Michael,
most bananas, like game that has the most reliance on player interaction, people will figure out a way to solo that game.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And even there were a lot of fan-made Undaunted ones before the official one came out. And Michael Kelly from One Stop Co-op Shop had a good one. And so somebody's gonna, they'll, if nothing else, somebody will make one, and it'll be sort of a generic thing, right? That can be applied broadly to scenarios and stuff like that. And it won't be perfect, and it will rely on players to make a lot of interpretations, which is what David Digby and David Xerxes didn't require, right? But yeah, that's sort of why we landed where we did.
So then you and Trevor come out with Resist. You're like, you know what? Let's move away from this whole multiplayer thing. Let's make a solo dedicated game. And like, what was the impetus here? Like, was this your answer to War Chest and Undaunted of being multiplayer games? Like, how did this come about?
So it's us in addition to Roger Tankers. And so he's another co-design partner on this. And Roger and I had worked previously on Sniper Elite. And he is actually a co-worker for my day job life.
Oh, okay. You brought one of them in, a convert.
Yeah. And he actually had lived in the UK, even though he's an American. He had lived in the UK at the same time as I did. So the three of us worked on this. And the origin story of it is the publisher, Salt and Pepper. They are a Spanish publisher historically involved with localizations, right? Spanish localizations. The main person there is also a historical gamer, and he had reviewed some of my war games, and he reached out to me and said, hey, I want to start publishing not just, localizations. I want us to do some original games. I want you to design something for me, but you can do whatever you want. Right? Just design a game for me. And so I was like, well, that sounds awesome, but for like a year or two, I had just stuff constantly on contract. And so I didn't have time. And he probably thought I was blowing him off. I was like, no, I really want to work with you, but I just don't have time. Well, it just happened like there was a 2-month period where all the stars aligned and I was free. And I reached out to Roger and Trevor and said, hey, Salt and Pepper wants me to do a game for them. I've got a couple of different ideas. What do you guys think about these two? And I threw out a couple of thematic ideas and sort of a pitch of what the core gameplay would be like. And I expected maybe neither one of them to be interested. One of them might be interested, but they both were. And so we have the irony of a solitaire game being designed by 3 guys. It's not lost on anybody, I'm sure. But yeah, so that they just said, hey, you can do whatever you want. The sky's the limit. And I, they did not apply this constraint to me. But when I looked at their catalog of stuff that they had done a lot of localizations for, it was stuff for like Button Shy or Watergate or something. So it's like small footprint games. It's sort of small component count and mostly cards. And so I said, okay, let's try to do something. Let's keep the component count down. Let's keep it to cards. What can we do with that? And so, yeah, and it gave me a chance to explore something, a historical bit of, you know, a bit of history that I wasn't familiar with. Spanish Maquis. Like if you say Maquis to people, they'll probably think Star Trek Deep Space Nine if they're a nerd.
A good nerd.
They might know the French Maquis, but like nobody knows it was Spanish. So it's a super, you know, unknown thing.
They could think of Voyager. I mean, that's okay.
Yeah, that's true. That's next level nerd. That's like
I watched through all of DS9 with my wife, and then I was like, hey, I watched Voyager when it was live, so you can watch all that with me. And she was like, this was not an equal trade. I promise season 4 it gets better.
To anybody that's watching right now, if you're a Deep Space Nine nerd and you haven't already watched the Lower Decks episode, it's a homage to Deep Space Nine. You should, no offense, you should just turn this off now and go watch it.
Absolutely, Lower Decks is incredible. As a general Star Trek fan, who, you know, like that's just part of the zeitgeist and upbringing that I had, and I think everyone who has wanted more Star Trek can completely agree that Lower Decks has been the absolute best. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
So, historical games. We are living in a very sensitive time, and this by no means is me trying to be like, oh, the woke crowd is trying to shut things down or anything, but I do think about how the conversation around what's appropriate to depict in games is evolving, that we're trying to be more welcoming and sensitive as a community, which I think for the most part is a very good thing, but sometimes that can feel at odds with the authenticity of the things that we're trying to present as well. There's a specific interest to having things as historically accurate as possible in a lot of war games, historical games, and that does mean that you might have a player faction that is the Nazis. You're going to sit down and one of you is going to be the Nazis, or, you know, some other fascist group, or there may be some other atrocities that are associated with this. And as you dig into the cultures of the past, there are problematic elements with the good guys. There's problematic elements with oh so many things. How has this affected your work as a historical game designer, if at all?
Yeah. Oh, that's a long conversation. It's so
that's okay. I've booked this for the next 3 hours.
every So every designer is different. This is obviously, I'm only speaking for myself. So every thing that I look at is a matter of like, you know, am I comfortable doing this person? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I don't really do anything modern. Like let's talk. Right now I'm talking primarily historical games through a war game, like a right. conflict. So modern day, and that has to do with I've worked for the Department of Defense now. I was prior Air Force, deployed to Iraq multiple times. I've been there. I don't want anything to do with it. I want to play games about it. I don't want to design games about it. I don't really design games. The closest I've done is, I mentioned it in passing earlier, a game called Europe Divided, which is a post-Cold War game that I designed after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. People don't talk about a whole lot before the current invasion. But like, I guess maybe I was living in Pollyanna. I didn't realize how bad it was going to be. So it was a lot of that was actually kind of future looking. But most of the stuff I design, the historical war game stuff I design, is what we call skirmish level, right? So it's like very personal. Like mm-hmm. each counter is a person, and most of the historical games I design are about real people. I don't feel comfortable designing those games about people that are still alive.
Yeah, totally.
For example, right? So every person's different, right? That's my comfort level. Usually, I'm okay with depicting and both sides. Most conflicts are all shades of gray. There are some conflicts where the shades are darker and lighter, like World War II's an example where the good guys were a pretty light shade of gray and the bad guys were a really, really dark shade of gray. Right?
Absolutely.
Black.
Absolutely.
Some other conflicts aren't as black and white. But even in those, right? So like in Undaunted, the U.S. side represents a very specific unit. The German side winds up representing different units throughout. And so sometimes they're a Wehrmacht unit, sometimes they are SS, or they are actually genuinely Nazis. Um, that level of representation I'm okay with, both in terms of playing and representing in a game. Sometimes. And so, for an example, right, because it's best to just give you specifics, it's one of the games I've designed is called Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms. It's from a same system of games as other games. Like there's other games in that same series. Um, those are all solitaire games where you're playing the defender against an aggressor, right? So you're typically taking on just the role of the good guy, if you will, in that sense. But I always create like a variant. It's a 2-player variant. It's primarily to let you run the game if you're teaching somebody. Right? Like it's not if you're playing like Castle Itter or Pavlov's House or something, and you're playing the Germans, you're just kind of teaching the other player how to play it because your side's really not that interested. Just there as a variant. I didn't allow players to do that in Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms because it's Germans and like they're SS and SA Germans and Danzig City Police who end up setting the building on fire and burning people alive. And I was like, I'm not making a game where you can do that, right? So every game is different, right? It's based on the what's the designer's comfortable with and the position they want to allow the players to be put in and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think you just kind of have to decide for yourself. Am I doing this? And other people disagree with me about this, right? They look at design as more of a simulationist model, right? Like I'm just giving the players a model of history. It's theirs to explore. I'm not really interested in doing that, right? For me, it's more of an exploration of like trying to evoke emotions and provide a feeling of something that was going on, right? Rather than just a sort of simulation of it. And so I'm not interested in putting people in certain positions.
Well, let's talk about the hotness. Let's bring it back to an easier conversation here. Instead of the hot seat, we'll go back to the hotness. This is Stalingrad. This is so exciting. It is a huge box that people can get their hands on. It is a much more, I guess, ambitious version of Undaunted, and it is taking place in Russia. You have these dynamic elements with the board, with the loadouts that you have as far as the units. Like when you started the design work on Stalingrad, like how many of these elements were you planning on from the get-go? Like was this a creative design and pursuit that you wanted to expand this whole thing, or did it kind of crop up organically as you were just like, well, what can we do that's new, and you just had ideas crop up and then work on them from there?
Yeah, so it's funny. I mentioned a couple of times, that Osprey, like we just to pull the curtain back a little bit, Trevor and I are done with the next 2 Undaunted, right? So we're literally like, I think usually about 2 or 3 years ahead of so Osprey runs a final machine.
Wait a second. Okay, so we have Battle of Britain.
So we're working on what's after Battle of Britain.
Okay.
Right.
And we're not getting any details here, right?
No,
we're not getting any scoops.
Oh my God.
Okay.
No, oh my goodness.
Okay. I won't rake you over the coals for that. Okay. Just knowing that there is another thing after Battle of Britain. Battle of Britain looks like at least from the box art, it seems to be a little bit slimmer of a package, maybe more in line with Undaunted Normandy and with North Africa.
Right.
Is this other one maybe more ambitious? Can we? Okay.
No way, man.
Back to Stalingrad.
So what's
wink to me twice if
I need a distress word.
Yeah.
So,
you work for Department of Defense. You've been through the whole rigmarole. Okay.
So the actual first time ever anybody spoke any word about what would eventually become Undaunted was like within a couple of months of Normandy having been released, right? So we're talking way back, literally 5 years ago, right? Trevor and I were emailing back and forth, and we were talking about, because remember, North Africa at this point has basically been designed. and we said, well, what would the next Undaunted be like? And we talked about, well, it could be set in the Eastern Front, it could be in Stalingrad, and Stalingrad makes a lot of sense to have some persistent effects, right? So that was the first we ever talked about it. We started seriously talking to Osprey about it within about a year of that, and we settled on Stalingrad at that point. But Osprey was the ones who said we want it to be legacy. And when I say legacy, I mean like no kidding destructive. That's what they wanted. That's what they asked us to design. And Trevor and I were always a bit like, ugh, this seems not right. It's that, we're a little bit skittish about legacy. But the point that Osprey was trying to make was they wanted it to no kidding, feel weighty. Like when a person dies, they're dead. They're not coming back ever. And so we were like, okay, that we're a little bit hesitant to do this. We're a lot hesitant to do this, but we're going to do it. So we met with them at Spiel. I think it was Spiel 2019 or 2020. I can't remember which one. So it was myself, Trevor, Philip, and Anthony, who are guys with Osprey. And we basically over dinner that night we listed what does Undaunted Stalingrad have to have, right? And it wasn't a whole bunch of in-depth stuff. It was just a list of things it had to have. And some of it was just like it has to still feel like Undaunted. We can't. It has to be something that's familiar, right? But then we started listing all the things it was going to have, and I can't. I have to be a little bit careful because people still haven't played it yet, so I don't want to spoil stuff because there's a lot of things that are going to pop up. But people are going to see some stuff that they've seen a little bit before in North Africa and reinforcements, maybe some twists to it. They're going to see some brand new stuff they've never seen before. But a lot of that stuff came out of that meeting, that was like the very first sort of conceptualization meeting, what it's going to be. So when Trevor and I started the first ever design work on it, we already knew that it was going to be a legacy game, that it was going to be, and it was going to have all these sort of elements, these persistent elements. So things like soldiers were going to die, they were going to be able to get promoted, the world was going to change around them. It was going to have this insane branching narrative that I lost years of my life mentally coming up with. All of that was there from the start, right? And so it was just a matter of trying to go back and say, okay, how do we make this all? And there were two things that in retrospect were probably the most challenging. One, I already mentioned, the branching narrative and all the implications of that. Like, so every scenario has to have an impact. Some more significant than others, but everyone has to have an impact, create a separate branch. How do we make it feel like a full campaign? Make it feel like you've been fighting over a few streets of land for 2 months, but be meaningful, and provide a different experience every single time you play it. So that was one. And then obviously it has to come together at the end. And then the other thing, and this might sound silly, is like how do we make injuries work or death work, right? And what I mean by that is the Undaunted doesn't function unless you have scouts and rifles. You can't play the game unless you can scout and control. So we couldn't lose those. You can't just let those people die, right? So the magic solution we came up with is that if you lose your riflemen, your scouts, or your machine gunners, those people do die. They go away. You'll never get them again. They're replaced by reinforcements, these reservists who, if anybody's ever played Undaunted before, you know that every single person is an individual. They have their own art. They have their own name. They're a person. That person dies, they're replaced by a nameless reservist, right? And so thematically what's happening is, well, you're getting these waves of recruits, and it's the sort of cliche in the war movies, like don't bother learning this guy's name because it's not going to live long.
He's a red
mechanically
shirt.
They're just a worse. He's a red shirt. That's exactly right. Mechanically they are weaker, right? So they're still a rifleman, so they can still function. The game still can propel forward, but they're a weaker version. And so there's both a thematic and a mechanical reason you don't want to keep them. But then if it's not one of those core, if it's not a rifleman, a machine gunner, or a scout, if they die, they're dead. If you've got your team of engineers and there's 3 of them to start with, and one of them dies, you know that you're never getting that person back. And so that was the solution we finally came up with, and I'm really happy with where we landed. But wow, that took a long time to get there.
board games are your creative output, one of your creative outputs, or your primary creative output. You don't rely on it as your source of income. So, really, this is you putting your outside effort from your primary job into bringing something into the world, to be able to say something, to be able to facilitate something for other people. And it's clear you draw a lot of inspiration from other games out there, from your history. We've talked about games that might have made an impact on you, and you've talked in other sources about games that have made an impact on you. But I'm wondering if there are non-board game creative things that have made an impact on you that inspire your design work. Like whether it's music or books or things that drive your creativity that you draw on to, like help you come up with ideas or to inspire you to reach for something or some sort of tonal quality. Like, what do you draw inspiration from?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's any one thing. I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of history podcasts, read a lot of books. I think that, and I don't ever, I think this is a true statement. I generally don't try to seek out ideas, right? Like I'm not, oh, I need an idea for a board game. Let me go read some books or whatever. It's through the course of the day, I'll be reading a book or I'll be whatever, listening to a podcast and something will pop up and I'm like, oh, that sounds very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start doing a little research. And what'll happen, this is the sort of the creative spark for me. I'll hear something in passing. I'll do a really quick deep dive into it, right? Read all about it, consume it. In the background of while I'm consuming that, it'll be like, how does that get turned into a game, right? And then I might jot some ideas down, but usually I don't. Usually it's like, how does that get turned into a game? And it just kind of sits there. And most of the time that I think about working on like new stuff, like fresh ideas or whatever, is when I'm jogging. I'll be jogging, I'll think about it. If I keep jogging and I keep having the same thoughts about the same game idea, then I know I have to work on that game. Like
Dude, I know it.
Right?
The Cardboard Herald, this whole thing that I started doing podcast interviews, I actually have a recording from like 7 years ago now where I was running. I'm a couple miles back in the Tongass National Rainforest here in Juneau. And I was thinking about this idea of like, well, if Mark Maron interviews comedians on WTF, who's doing that for board games? And that idea just kept on imprinting over the music or other podcasts that I was listening to. So I actually stopped and, I had nothing to write on. So I'm out of breath. Just talking into the phone being like, WTF, except for board games. And then you could do review blog in order to help grow it and understand more about board games. And that was like the entire genesis of this thing.
That's awesome. I hope you still have that voice memo.
I think I do. I think for, I don't do as many interviews. I want to do more. But in the beginning, it just kind of happened. And I got to like 100 episodes. I'd interviewed Reiner Knizia and Bruno Catala and all these, people, Francesco Nepatello, like people that I was like, oh my God, these are like interviewing, I don't know, Ringo Starr or something. Well, I could have picked any other Beatle, but whatever, like it was like you, like this is meeting someone who's very interesting and fantastic. And I had no idea that I was going to be able to pull off some of this. And I think for like the 100th episode, I put that recording into, just the audio podcast that it was at the time. I didn't even have a video channel at that point. But anyway, I kind of derailed it. So you're running, you come up with ideas, and then you allow that to marinate a little bit.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, if I can't get the idea out of my head at that point, then I know I have to make a game. And if I don't come back to it, if I read about it, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what a game would be like. If I don't have to make it, if it doesn't just stay in my mind, right, then I know, okay, I don't need to worry about that, right? And sometimes it takes a long time to circle back and have the time to work on it. I'm super, super blessed right now because this is a hobby and it's whatever it is, part-time job, hobby thing that it is. Um, I'm super blessed right now because of the success of things like War Chest and Undaunted. It means that those stay on contract, and I'm kind of obligated to keep working on those, and I'm people will commission me for other things. So that's all great, but it doesn't mean I have a ton of time to come up with necessarily my own new ideas, right? So they might get put on the back burner.
One of the great things about historical games is that when you sit down to play them, it immerses you in something that you might not actually know all that much about, especially for the outsider like me. And I can read the notes in it, and I can read about the research. A lot of historical game designers are really great about putting notations for the sources that they read to research the subject, and kind of following that rabbit trail to go back to the music comparison with Ringo Starr. As a musician myself, one of my favorite things to do is find out who are my favorite bands' favorite bands, the people that inspired them, the things that they researched. I'm wondering if you as a designer have ever changed your mind or had your perspective changed, or like had your mind blown from some preconceived notion when you started designing a game, and then you actually got into the research to make sure that it was historically accurate.
Yeah, so that's happened quite a few times. The most the most like obvious one of those, I guess, or most significant one of those, and I've mentioned this before a couple of times, not with you, just in past conversations, is when I was working on Pavlov's House.
Mm-hmm.
So the origin of that one, I worked on the game called Castle Italy. That design was complete. It was very much this sort of World War II defense of a single point, uh, by some defenders. That's a whole separate story that I won't get into. But but after I was done with that, I reached out to the community and I said, hey, does anybody have some good ideas for a game that can be a follow up? And somebody recommended Pavlov's House, and I was like, oh, I kind of know about Pavlov's House. The Soviets defended this building for a couple of months, right? That's what I knew about it. And when I started researching, I was like, oh my god, like not only am I wrong about this, but pretty much most of the Western world is wrong about this, right? Like what we think is that the Soviets, a small group of infantrymen defended this building by themselves for a couple of months, and that's definitely not what happened, right? And the reason we think that is because that's what the Soviets wanted the world to think. There was this huge myth, this huge propaganda that was created around this concept of a few people holding out and few infantrymen holding out defending this apartment building. And instead, there was massive, multi-concerted effort, operational scale effort that was defending many places, but one of which was Pavlov's House. So there was this huge effort that was for this defense. And so that was an example. And I actually, when I do my historical war games, I usually write a companion book that goes with it, right? And so usually it's about 40 pages of like, some of it's design notes, but most of it's just history for it. And so there's a section in that companion book for Pavlov's House where I talk about debunking the myth of to go into detail about literally everything that was part of the myth and everything that's reality. And there's basically more wrong than right.
Well, that is incredible, because I know almost nothing about Pavlov's House other than knowing the name and then looking in your I guess your board game published board game ology, filmography, except for board games, your library of board games, and then going Pavlov's House. I know that name. Where do I know that name? Okay, going back Soviets. Like I have this interest in the Soviet Union, as were many of the people who were born in the 80s, but a lot of it is just layman's knowledge. So that's something I'm definitely going to have to research. It's something that I would love to talk to you more about, but it's late. It's late, man. You're on the East Coast. It's late here in Juneau, so I am going to have to do this as a follow-up conversation. For now, what I'm going to say is that everyone out there, if you have any notion of historical games as being this impenetrable and opaque niche of board games that you've wanted to find your way to the table, but you haven't figured out how to get that foothold. Undaunted is absolutely a fantastic way to do that. And then if you're looking for that meaty experience, it sounds like Undaunted Stalingrad is the bee's knees. I have zero concerns about that being an absolute hit. And thank you for coming on to the show and for all that you've given the world. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been awesome.